Hi, and welcome to Gen Z Bible class. Now, if you've been with us before, you will realize that I am not back home in my cozy little living room. We're actually on vacation this week. I didn't have a chance to tape this session, so I'm going to do it here and let you know a little bit about where we are. Actually, we're in the beautiful Adirondack Mountains of New York State. I was actually going to try to find a place out in the woods to record this, but my wife was out there this morning and she said the bugs were terrible. We have these little things called black flies up here, and so I decided I better not, spend the whole time swatting bugs off my neck. So I decided to do it inside, but we're still going to be working on the same stuff. Little bit about where we are. We're at a place called The Pines, which is this is a little advertisement, I guess, which is a campground at Word of Life, which is a place that we've been coming to for many, many years. There's a Bible Institute here, and my kids had attended that, all three of my kids, so we're very familiar with this area. And it's just always nice to get out into the mountains and the fresh air and the trees. So you can see, I threw in a few pictures here of where we're at, just to get an idea what's up. But we're going to continue on in Genesis chapter 6. And if you'll remember, last time we were talking about how Noah was commissioned to build this boat. And, the fact that he lived a life of such faith, and that was a real, I think, spiritual lesson to us. And we're really going to see the same thing as we continue on. And we've gotten up to verse 15, which is where we're going to start. Or we will read verse 15 and 16. And now we're getting some specific instructions as to how Noah was to build this ark. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door on the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks. So, if you don't know what a cubit is, it was a measurement that was supposed to be somewhere between here and here, and it sort of ends up being like around 18 inches. There were different versions. I guess if you had a longer arm, your cubit would be a little longer. But basically, in our system of measurement, this boat was 450 feet long. That's like a football field and a half. I mean, that's long. By 75 feet high. So we're not talking about some little canoe here. We're talking about a serious vessel. And if you figure 3 different decks, it was about 10,000 square feet. The roof, of course, was necessary because of the rain. There were windows for ventilation, so we get this, specific information about it. And you remember how we were talking about, so many people look at this story and they say, this is just some fairy tale. I mean, it couldn't have been possible anyway. But if you really dig into it and you look at these dimensions that were just given, just from an engineering standpoint, it actually does kind of make sense. And, we'll talk a little bit about the animals and how they could have been in there and all this stuff. But one of the things about this, and just like we were talking about with the genealogies, that if this was some fairy tale, why would all these details have been included? And the reason they were included is because it's not a fairy tale. It really did happen. These are books of history. And so it's kind of interesting. If you look at the Bible, there are some other examples of places where God gave people specific dimensions, like blueprints for what they were to build. One of them was for the tabernacle. This is in the book of Exodus, when Israel had, left Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea and they're wandering around in the wilderness. And God gave them specific plans how to build this tabernacle, which was like a big tent. And it could be, set up and then taken down again because they moved from place to place. And, why he gave these particular dimensions, we don't really know, but they were very specific. Another place is something in the book of Ezekiel, which describes a temple that has not yet been built, the temple of the Lord, which has not yet been actually built. But chapters 40 through 43, I mean, this is a lot of information and all kinds of details about how it was to be built and the size and all this stuff. And finally, there's one more example in the book of Revelation where it gives the dimensions of the New Jerusalem. You know, I think the last time we talked about the new heavens and the new earth that would come along, and this giving us this picture of the new heavens, the New Jerusalem, which is like a big cube. There's 3 gates on each side and one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. I mean, it's just fantastic. So we have that to look forward to. Another thing we want to think about is the fact that, you know, there have been a lot of, besides this account in the Bible, there have been a lot of accounts of a flood, a worldwide flood. And I think that's because this really did happen. It was a real event in history. Although some of these other accounts have been kind of, I guess you could say, fictionalized. One in particular was found in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, this was kind of curious. This was Sumeria, and they were digging around in Nineveh back in the 1800s, and they came up with these, I guess they were tablets, and they had this long poem, this long story about this guy who also experienced this same kind of a flood thing. And a lot of the details were very, very similar. He was commissioned to build this boat, only in his case it was a box. Not so sure how well that would have floated and put all these animals on. Of course, he did it in 5 days, which doesn't seem to be very realistic either. Whereas Noah, it took him 100 years, which makes a little more sense. But the point is that you see this story, this memory, this ancient memory of a flood. And I think that's really encourages me to believe that this is something that really did happen because of this collective memory that people have about the flood and the fact that there was a flood. So let's continue on. Genesis 6:17 and 18. I am going to bring the flood waters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens. Every creature that has breath of life in it, everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, and you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. So God says he's going to make a covenant with Noah. This word covenant is something that becomes kind of a thing in the Bible. What does it mean? Well, it's an agreement. I guess you could also use the word contract, where God says specifically what he is going to do. And, you know, God's word is God's word. What he says he will do. Whatever he speaks will come to be, as says in the Bible. So he makes this promise to Noah, which I think would have been encouraging to him, because you have to remember what Noah was going through, that this whole world had never seen anything like a flood. And he was commissioned to build this huge monstrosity of a boat. And what people must have thought over that course of 100 years, how difficult it must have been for Noah to stick to his agreement and continue to obey God, even though, people were probably laughing and scorning him through this whole process. But we do have this covenant, and God promises Noah he's going to bring him through this whole experience. And we might want to just stop and ask this question: what was the world going to be like when he steps off this ark? Because he didn't know. I mean, it's just like, God didn't give him specific information about every little thing that's going to happen. And I think that's an interesting thing. It's kind of a spiritual principle. When we obey God, he doesn't always tell us, exactly what's going to happen. He will give us directions, and then we are responsible to do our part, and then he is responsible to do his part. And that's exactly what we see going on here in this whole story of Noah and the ark. So what were the differences between the world before the flood and the world after the flood? And when that boat lands on, top of the mountain, what does Noah see when he gets out? And some of this is still kind of speculation, but I think there are some pretty good theories about how things might have changed, just say in the physical world. Now, we had gotten into this whole creation thing, and I gave you some references, and I'll see if I can remember to leave some links that might help answer some of these questions. But one of the common notions was that during the world before the flood, that we didn't see so much blue sky and direct sunlight, that there was kind of this shroud that covered the earth. And, violent rainstorms and things like that just might not have been a part of the early, the pre-flood world. So that when Noah gets off the ark, and one of the things that kind of heads us in this direction is that it says there was this promise of a rainbow, and that Noah never would have seen a rainbow before. Well, how do you make a rainbow? You have to have direct sunlight, reflecting off a cloud. And that's why some people feel like the atmosphere had changed. And certainly the topography had changed. We know that there was this violent flood, that this was worldwide, and that there wouldn't have been any landmarks left that Noah would have recognized. That flood had destroyed everything, and a lot of people feel like that at this point it was these high mountains that we have now were lifted up as the tectonic plates were kind of being shoved around and pushed against each other, that continents were separated. There's a lot of really good thinking going behind a lot of these theories. Now again, we weren't there, so we don't know exactly, but there were some definite physical changes that went on at this time. But I think there were some spiritual changes too. And again, we're kind of getting into an area of speculation, but I would have to ask the question, remember we're talking about all this demonic stuff that was going on in the world before the flood. The sons of these fallen angels were marrying the daughters of men and having all these Nephilim creatures. Again, we're admitting that we don't know exactly what that was, but we do know that the earth was permeated with Satan's plan to destroy families and to destroy God's order. So why just destroy all that, bring Noah into the same kind of world, and then have the same thing happen all over again? Well, I think there were some spiritual changes that were made as well. And again, we don't really know because we weren't there, but there's a little hint in a verse that we find in the second to the last book in the Bible, the book of Jude, where, and I'll just read that to you, Jude there's only one chapter, so it has to be chapter 1, starting in verse 6. And the angels who did not keep their positions of authority, but abandoned their proper dwelling, these he has kept in darkness, bound with everlasting chains for judgment on that day. And, we don't know exactly what that means, but we do know that it refers to some fallen angels that have been, and this is in the past, that are at this time locked away. And what I'm thinking is that probably God had put his hand of restraint on Satan and these angelic beings so that they couldn't get away with that again, so that he was not going to allow that same kind of corruption to enter the earth. Again, it's kind of in the realm of theory, but I really believe that is something like that had to have happened. Okay, let's continue on now, and we're going to read a couple of more verses. Verses 19 and 21. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Okay, so who is on the ark? Well, you got the animals. And, this is where one of the areas where people say, how could this be true? How can, Noah had fed all these animals. We have this cartoon image of, Noah looking out the window of the ark and the giraffe's head sticking out, because he doesn't fit inside. Well, if you do the math, and as we said, we had something like 10,000 square feet there. And a couple of other things to keep in mind is that there are actually a lot more varieties of animals in the world today than there would have been at that time. And one way we can illustrate this is by looking at dogs. Dogs, wow, what do they have to do with it? Well, all of the variety of dogs that we have today, you have your Great Danes and you have your little Chihuahuas and you have all kinds of things in between, didn't really exist even 200 years ago. It was all through selective breeding. But all that Noah would have needed would be a couple of animals with that genetic information in them in order to arrive at all these different variations of dogs. And the same with horses, and the same with, all you needed really was the basic genetic information. And then, you ask the question, how in the world did he handle all these animals, squawking and, trying to run around and, all this stuff? Well, another possible idea is that God might have put many of them in a state of hibernation. And, that's a real thing. I'm always amazed. My wife and I will go for a walk along the canal, and it's only like 3 feet deep. And all summer long you see turtles and frogs, and you see these big carp swimming around, and you see all kinds of beavers and muskrats and all kinds of wildlife. And yet in the winter, and we're talking about at least 4 months here, we're up in a cold part of central New York where everything freezes and all that water just turns to ice. And how do these animals survive? Well, God has given them the ability to hibernate and to survive these conditions. So he might have been doing something like that. And I guess another question is, well, what about the lions? And wouldn't they want to eat the lambs? Well, here's some speculation on that thought. We know that in this new heaven and new earth that we were talking about last time, things are going to be a little bit different. And we get this from a passage in Isaiah, and this is what he describes as part of that time. Isaiah 11, starting at verse 6. The wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together, and the lion will eat straw like the ox. And it goes on, and it talks about how, the whole created order is living in harmony with each other. And, that's going to be kind of a cool thing. Now, we don't really know from the time that Adam and Eve were, hanging out together before they disobeyed God. I think we can assume that that's what the world was like then, and the animals were getting along with each other. There was no death. So we don't really know at what point lions started, eating lambs. All of this kind of remains in the realm of mystery. But let's just sum it up by saying this, that Noah was commissioned to do his part, and then God was going to do the rest. God takes care of, getting the animals on the ark. He didn't tell Noah to go out, I want you to catch 2 frogs, and I want you to catch, 2 squirrels and 2 little mice and a couple of, kangaroos. It wasn't like that. God had to orchestrate the part that Noah couldn't do. I mean, this was really a miraculous thing that God did. And I think we learned something about how God works, is that he commissions us to do the part that he wants us to do so that we have the opportunity to obey him. But then he does the things that we can't do. He does the real work. Even if you think about something like, sharing the gospel with somebody, and, you see somebody that needs to have their life changed. You don't do that by a bunch of therapy sessions. You do that you really allow God to do that by putting his spirit within inside someone who repents and, has their life changed from the inside. The other thing that it said was on the ark was food. Now, I guess that makes sense. He's on the ark. They're on the ark for like a year. And so, you know, you're going to get a little hungry after a little while. So they had to bring food for themselves, but they would have had to bring food for animals as well if they weren't, I'm sure they weren't all sound asleep. So they needed food, but they also would have needed to bring seeds for planting. You know, they get off the ark, and I'm sure there were still kind of plenty of seeds floating around, you know, that could have found a place to germinate, so that they didn't have to like repopulate the world in terms of vegetation. But I'm sure they would have wanted to bring some, you know, standard crops along with them, maybe corn or wheat or barley or whatever it is. So they had to keep all these things in mind, which is probably why it took 100 years for Noah to get, not just build a boat, but to make all the plans for, you know, these extra things that they had to consider. But as we kind of come to an end here, I want to think about the spiritual lessons that we learn. And actually, it's interesting how in the New Testament you can go to a couple of places where Noah in particular is identified and he is remembered. And he has this lasting legacy. One of them we find in the book of Hebrews, and this is, you know, thousands of years after Noah lived, but he is remembered as a man of faith. That's part of his legacy. Hebrews 11:7. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. And by his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of righteousness that is in keeping with faith. So Noah, and this whole thing in Hebrews was like a list of men, great men of faith. And Noah is listed there, obviously, because just think of the faith that he had to exercise in doing this stuff. Like I said before, people must have thought he was crazy. There was never any notion. We don't even know if at that point there were like open oceans in the world. If it was just one, you know, massive continent that certainly never would have had the need for. We know there were rivers, so maybe they had little canoes that they could float around in. But you know, beyond that, the idea of building this monstrosity of a boat just wouldn't have made any sense. But Noah was faithful, and it said because of the fear that he had, that God, you know, he knew that God would keep his word, and the things that God was talking about were very fearful. You know, this destruction of the whole earth. But it stands for us as an example as well. Because people can look at us and say, you guys are crazy. You think, you know, all this stuff's going to happen. You think you're going to die and go to heaven. And, you know, there's all of this these types of people in the world that are either in rebellion against God or they don't want to have anything to do with him. And they look at us and they think we're crazy. You know, I think Charles Schulz illustrated that in his cartoon, Snoopy. Snoopy was always out there waiting for it was Charlie Brown who was waiting for the great pumpkin to appear. And, of course, he never did. But it was kind of an illustration, I guess. We're always waiting for Jesus to come back. And for 2,000 years, people have been waiting for him. And, you know, but we believe, and when we see all the things happening now and what the Bible has said was going to happen is coming to being right before our very eyes. Just like Noah knew that what God said would come about and that he would do what he said. And so he lived his life in preparation for that day. So I'm going to end in another part of the New Testament, which talks about these same types of things. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting at verse 20. To those who were disobedient long ago, when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built, in it only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through the water. And this water symbolizes baptism. And he goes on to draw this spiritual analogy, but he's mentioning specifically the situation with Noah. How that there were people back then that were laughing at him and making fun of him. And yet Noah remained faithful to this calling And as a result, God did exactly what he said in saving Noah and his family. And it talks about, Peter is using this as an example to explain what baptism is like. And, we understand baptism from a Christian standpoint as being an expression of our faith and our obedience to God. And that when the reason you get dunked is because it's symbolic. It's almost like, Noah going through this flood. But we are dunked, we die to ourselves, to our old lives. And just like Noah was putting that whole old world behind him, and we are raised again to a new life. That's what baptism symbolizes. So we can see that kind of illustrated here in this whole story of Noah. And then finally, what does this mean for us? And here is another verse from 1 Peter again in the previous chapter, chapter 2. And I'm going to read verse 12, and this is going to be our good verse to end on. It's kind of a verse that challenges us to live like Noah did, to live a life of faith like Noah did. And here Peter is encouraging those who he is writing to live that kind of life of faith. He says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Peter and the believers at that time had to make a commitment to live a life of faith. And really, we find ourselves in the same position today. And so we are called to live such good lives, good examples, to set such good examples in living our righteous lives that even though the world might look at us and say, we don't believe what you believe, but they're going to see the presence of Christ in us as we live lives of righteousness. And it's a very curious thing how people will, maybe make fun of you, but when they get into trouble and they need some real help, very often you're the person that they're going to come to because they know there's something different about us. Well, anyway, we take this story, this historic event of Noah and the ark, and we see a lot of spiritual principles that set examples for us. So I hope it's been a blessing to you. And I guess next time I see you, I'll be back in my cozy little living room. But in the meantime, we're going to enjoy our time up here in the mountains. And I do hope you're able to join us again on Gen Z Bible class.